any formalities, Kate, or just?
Yeah, I think we do, since it's a public meeting.
Okay, all right.
So we'll run through the typical process.
All right, so I will call to order the May, what is this, 15th retreat of the Evanston Preservation Commission, and declare that we have a quorum. We do have to, I guess, so we have to vote to open the meeting, or I'm sorry, to waive the rules.
Suspend the rules, yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so then I guess we have to do a roll call vote. So Commissioner, I'm sorry, we need a, I don't think we need a motion. Commissioner Reinhold.
Aye.
Who's next? Commissioner Morris.
Aye.
Commissioner Jacobs.
Aye.
Commissioner Sullivan.
Aye.
Commissioner Dreller.
Aye.
Commissioner Bodan.
Aye.
Commissioner Cohen.
Aye.
And I'm an aye. So I guess I'll turn it over to you guys to introduce the speakers.
All right, Kate, you want to go first, or you have any preference?
Why don't you go first, Carlos?
Okay.
Because I think Richard's going to speak first, and then.
Okay, that's right. So I'm very happy and have the pleasure to introduce Richard Friedman, who is an attorney at Neal and Leroy in Chicago. And I met Richard a few years ago when we were doing the nomination for the Northeast Evanston Historic District, and he was our attorney to run all the public hearings, and he makes sure that the commission follow all the rules, all the procedural legal matters, and he kind of navigated with the commission in a very efficient way, quietly but effectively, things that the commission ought to do and not do at the end. And then after that, we developed a friendship over the years, and I learned that he was teaching at the Art Institute, Historic Preservation, and he's also an educator. And from time to time, he has asked me to go to his class and speak about what we do in Evanston in general, and about historic preservation. So I'm really pleased to present Richard Friedman. So here it is, Richard. It's all yours.
Well, thank you, Carlos, and hello, everybody, and thanks for inviting me. And I'm pleased to be here this Saturday morning. And a special thank you to Carlos for helping me out in my classes at the School of the Art Institute and being very generous to speak in the past several years to the class and giving them an idea of what historic preservation commissions do. So thanks very much, and glad to see you back, Carlos. Carlos, can you give me the screen, and I can begin to show my slides, or whoever has got in charge?
I think you should be able to share your screen.
Okay, let's give it a shot. Okay, does that work for you?
Yep, that worked.
Yeah, we can see.
Okay, fantastic. Okay, very good. Okay, well, this is my presentation, and this is me, and I do need to give you a disclaimer, being a lawyer and having once represented the Preservation Commission. Today's talk are really my thoughts. This isn't legal advice. This is not binding opinions on your ordinance, although I am going to talk about it. And for any binding opinion or legal advice, you'll need to talk to your corporation counsel. So that's the legal disclaimer. And I suppose anything that starts when we begin to talk about criteria or standards, we need to talk about where it all begins, and that's the Fifth Amendment to the United States Constitution. And I always tell my students that on the first day that you need to look at the Fifth Amendment to see the two provisions that guide us through the law of historic preservation. These are the basic rules of historic preservation. And the one I want to address right now is the Due Process Clause of the Fifth Amendment. And I think all Americans really know what due process is, but in the context of criteria and standards, we need to make sure that everybody that they're drawn in a way that everybody can understand them, and that the persons to whom it applies know how to conform their behavior to the standards. So I've kind of put it in lay terms of what due process means. It's the ability to know the meaning of the words, or what meaning they convey. And it's to the average persons, and most importantly, that most persons would agree on what the law requires. It's easy to formulate, but particularly when you come to artistic, aesthetic, creative, and cultural affairs, it's very, very difficult to apply. And I've drawn this arrow here to give the kind of the range of criteria and how they might be drawn and how they would apply to the due process clause. And over on the left side, I've got narrow and specific criteria, or narrow and specific standards, something like the standards that appear in the Evanston Ordinance. There are a finite number of them. And the point would be that, or the benefit of having narrow standards, simple standards, concise standards, is that they would be easy for everybody to understand. And importantly, there's less leeway for the administrators to apply them. There's very little discretion available. In that case, they'd be less likely to violate the due process clause. But the disadvantage might be that they are limiting in the range of circumstances that they might apply to. On the other hand, and you might have very broad standards. And as we'll see later, the federal secretary standards are fairly concise. There's 10 of them, but there are 4 or 5 different times that they might be applied. But I have to tell you that there are thousands of pages of interpretation, both on the standards that the federal government applies for the criteria for designation or the criteria for preservation, rehabilitation, and so on. They do cover a broad range of circumstances. They allow for flexibility, but they raise the question, and we're going to discuss that a little bit, of whether it's a guide or a rule. Are they mandatory or advisory? When you have so many of them, how do you actually apply them? The worst thing about them, I think, is that they provide an opportunity for discretion and application. And the problem is that they might represent the ideas of the government or the ideas of the individual administrators or the ideas of the Preservation Commission, yet there could be a vast area for disagreement because there's so many pages, so many circumstances that it's difficult to determine which one would apply, and if they do apply, whether they are narrowly drawn that everybody might agree. So this is the range of things for application of importantly, the due process clause of the Constitution. And I suppose that brings up the question of what we're talking about today. What's the difference between criteria and standards and guidelines? And the lawyer's answer is it depends. And I would say generally we think of criteria as being narrow and as being mandatory. And looking at the Evanston criteria, it seems to me that those are meet that standard of being mandatory and being narrow. There's so few of them, and they're fairly easy to understand. Standards and guidelines, it depends on what the issuing authority says they are. Issuing authority might be the city council, they might be the state legislature, they might be the Secretary of Interior. How do they describe how those standards and guidelines apply? I think the common and unfortunate mistaken idea is that standards and guidelines are mandatory, that are regulatory. And that isn't always the case. You have to examine what the issuing authority had intended. So one of the things I want to talk about is, very briefly, is diversity and the ability of landmark criteria or designation criteria to capture diversity, to capture previously unrecognized historic and cultural events, circumstances, and peoples. And to begin the discussion, we need to see how the criteria or how our designation ideas have evolved. And beginning in the late 19th century, or actually during the mid part of the 19th century, as America was beginning to understand its history and looking at some of the symbols of the American Republic, the kind of properties that were designated were national symbols. And I'm thinking of the very first one, which would be the Mount Vernon, saved by the Mount Vernon Ladies Association. Late in the 19th century, the United States Supreme Court, in the very famous Gettysburg decision, said that patriotism and national unity were made the acquisition of property for landmark purposes a public use. But later in the 20th century, we began to understand that it was much more involved, and historic districts began to be designated, and the criteria began to be thought of. What were the standards? What are the criteria for designating historic districts? And with the passage of the National Historic Preservation Act of 1966 and the kind of the universal adoption of all of the standards, we began to recognize that architectural masterpieces and aesthetics were an additional category that needed to be saved. And I remember my first assignment when I was in the Corporation Counsel's office of the city of Chicago. One of my first assignments was to sit with the Chicago Landmark Commissions, and I asked for that assignment because I was interested in Louis Sullivan and the threatened or destroyed landmarks at that time. And one of our aldermen came before the commission and said, you know, you've been designating all these landmarks downtown in the central business district, but my ward, which is on the northwest side of the city, doesn't have one. And I'm asking the commission to designate this old farmhouse that we have out here as a Chicago landmark. And I, with all the knowledge that I had, said, well, that thought to myself, didn't say anything. That's a stupid idea. We can't designate a landmark just because your ward doesn't have one. That's not a criterion. Your building was not designed by Louis Sullivan or Burnham and Roach, and doesn't qualify in my mind. I was totally wrong about that, because since that time, we've begun to recognize that not only the masterpieces of architecture should be designated, but also cultural markers, items that recognize aspects of the history of all our peoples, of all the people who participate in our democracy. The problem is that the criteria are sort of static. Throughout the United States, most municipalities have adopted the 6, 7, 8, or 9 standard criteria, most of which apply to these architectural masterpieces or maybe national symbols or historic districts. And they haven't changed or been adopted or adapted to reach the cultural aspects of minority populations or previously unrecognized cultural resources. So I'd like you to consider this building that I sort of picked out. And this is the home of Muddy Waters. And course, everybody recognizes Muddy Waters, how important he is for the Chicago area. And this is sort of a very typical, very poorly maintained, very poor condition building in the Lake Park neighborhood. And it's a place where Muddy Waters had a studio where he practiced in the decade between the mid-60s and the mid-70s. And mid-70s, he sold this building and moved elsewhere. So would this qualify as a historic landmark under the typical criteria? And so when I talk about typical criteria, let's look at the Muddy Waters house with respect to the Evanston criteria. And let's see if I can actually find it. I know I've got it here. So I'm going to get rid of my screen sharing for a moment and find my. Let's see, that's not it. Here we go. And let me get my screen sharing back. Okay. So this is a screenshot of the Evanston criteria. And we have 10 of them with possibly an 11th. And the question is, how do they relate to the particular resource under consideration? And are these mandatory or are they advisory? And the answer is clear here. Every nominated landmark must meet one of the following specified criteria and no others, and the commission shall limit its consideration to the following criteria. So would the Muddy Waters house, as an example of diversity and inclusion, something that might not have previously been considered, could that be nominated as a historic landmark under the standard criteria? And your criteria are very, very familiar, and the wording varies from municipality to municipality, but throughout the United States, they're pretty much the same. So would Muddy Waters house fit? Is this house significant to the broad patterns of history? Likely it does. Muddy Waters really is important to the culture of this area. What's the association with Muddy Waters? Well, the activities may or may not have taken place or involve the use of any of the existing improvements. Well, the existing improvements, as you can see, are in a fair condition, but actually in this case, we know that Muddy Waters at least maintained a studio in this building. So to that extent, you could make a very strong case that criteria 1 applies. Here's another one, maybe even more applicable. It's association with important cultural, societal aspects or events in the history of the city. I don't think there's any doubt that it could very well qualify under that one. And number 8 would be a stretch. I think number 8 really talks about districts, but it does represent an historic or cultural theme, perhaps, or again, by districts or objects that may or may not be contiguous. So it might be a stretch, but you could make a case. Possibly under 9, an established and familiar visual feature of the neighborhood. Number 10, maybe not. So there are some criteria that seems to allow the designation, if that's what the commission would want to do, to designate a house like Muddy Waters house as a landmark. But I think there's an impediment here. And the impediment is the 11th criteria. And again, Evanston has the same criteria, 11th criteria as exists throughout the country and exists, for example, in the criteria for evaluation for placement on the National Register. So any site or building must possess sufficient integrity of location, design, setting, materials, and workmanship and association to convey its historic significance. So if you're talking about physical integrity, I think it's sort of doubtful that the building has integrity. But maybe you could say, and I think you can make a good case, that it possesses integrity of association to convey its historic significance. So I'm not sure that integrity is at all helpful, because anything that you might want to designate presumably has some association with a cultural or historic or an aesthetic standard or value. So does this really add anything to talk about integrity? On the one hand, it could limit or veto inclusion of buildings because they don't have physical integrity. On the other hand, any historic landmark wouldn't be before the commission unless it had association to convey its historic significance. And by the way, integrity seems to be a fairly important aspect of Evanston's mission, because you are told to issue a report concerning your recommendation to the city council with not only an explanation of the significance, but the explanation of the integrity of the proposed landmark. So I'd like to look at integrity for a moment as an impediment to inclusion. And let me stop sharing. I've got another screen to show you, so let me see if I can get back to that one. Hold on. Let's try that. Sorry. Okay, we'll move to the next slide. Oh, by the way, before we move to the next slide, I did have just a very brief screenshot of some alternate criteria that I found throughout the country that may broaden the criteria to allow designation of previously unrecognized or minority or diversity kinds of cultural resources. So these are somewhat, a little bit broader than the ones we've examined. And so if ever comes a time to redraft the Evanston criteria, things like this might want to be considered. So let's talk about the meaning of integrity. Now, the title of this slide is The Ship of Theseus. Everybody has heard of the Ship of Theseus? Nobody's heard of it. Okay. Well, my favorite TV show, among the many, many automobile restoration shows on TV, maybe no one else watches them, but there are 3, 4, or 5, or every night there's several. And the host finds a beat up car like this 1967 E-Type Jaguar. And after a little bit of work on it, lo and behold, what do they have? So here's Mike Brewer in my favorite show in Wheeler Dealers and this Jag that they found. And here's the end result after a bit of work. What has that got to do with integrity? And what's the Ship of Theseus? The Ship of Theseus is an old story. The king of Athens, Theseus, was a victor in many naval battles. So to memorialize him, the people of Athens preserved one of his ships, and they preserved it over a period of time. And as time passed, the wood began to rot, and they replaced the deck, and they replaced the masts, and they replaced the timbers. And after several hundred years, what did they have? Was that the ship of Theseus. Can you say that after several hundred years and the replacement of everything, that you have anything that has any integrity? Does this beautiful Jaguar have any integrity, any relationship to the original that it came from? Whether they replaced the fenders, the floor pan, the engine, the running gear, is there any piece of this new Jaguar that came from the original? And the answer is we don't know. Does it represent the original? Does it have integrity? And the answer is, well, there is no answer. When I was with the Chicago Landmark Commission, there was this beautiful house that was designated. This is the one where the alderman did successfully lobby to get a landmark. And so it was designated by the commission. And unfortunately, for whatever reason, the owner of the landmark took out a permit. City issued the permit by mistake, and this official landmark was turned into timber. And so my assignment was to sue the owner and recover something. And the question is, what could I recover? What was the loss that the city suffered because of that dastardly deed? And one of the things that I toyed with was, and I totally rejected out of hand, was forcing the owner to rebuild the building in its as an original form. One of the importance of the buildings, aside from its aesthetic qualities and its age, was that it was probably one of the first examples in this area of the balloon frame construction. And it would be very instructive to see the interior construction of this building. And maybe it wouldn't have been so bad to reconstruct the building as a replica. It could be instructive both as to its visual character and why couldn't it be an example or a museum. Engineering students or any student could go through there and take a look at, granted, the replicated construction techniques, but you could replicate the hand-hewn nails, you could replicate the dimensioned lumber, and it might be a worthwhile project. It would not have a single shred of integrity under an integrity standard. So I'm showing on the screen some of the problematic but important cultural resources that might be eliminated under an integrity standard. The very famous battlefield at Gettysburg. It's problematic. We don't know, I mean, what's the extent of it? What are the boundaries of such a thing? But more importantly, what is there to preserve? It's a landscape. There are, to my knowledge, no extant buildings, no fences, nothing that, of the built environment at least, that would indicate anything about the battlefield. Geographic sites, that's correct. And that brings up the problem of what preservationists are calling cultural landscapes. I used to call them parks, and which do change over time. The plantings, the original trees in Jackson Park or Grant Park or whatever the landscape ideas were, they're long gone. Landscapes change. Some of the plantings are no longer appropriate or no longer available or disease prone, and we would plant them with something else. Does that have integrity? I've listed a number of sites where the original building has disappeared, yet they do represent very important cultural markers, and in my view, should be recognized. Would not hurt to have them recognized on their original site, yet of course have no integrity whatsoever other than integrity of association. So in Chicago, the site of Fort Dearborn, it's got a marker on the sidewalk, probably 25 feet above the surface of the ground. The site of Lincoln's nomination at the Wigwam, what used to be called the Fort Dearborn Massacre. We really know where it happened, or where DuSable's cabin was, or where Chicago fire started. All of these are very important. One of the funny things, ironic, I guess, is that you've all seen the U-505 submarine display at the Museum of Science and Industry, and I'm wondering how many people know that it's a National Historic Landmark. It's not just on the National Register, it is a National Historic Landmark. So does it have integrity? It's been modified, there's been holes cut in the side. You can walk in from through the hull of the ship as no one ever could when it was in service. They've removed the periscope and put it elsewhere. They've, I'm sure, restored some of the interior features. They've removed the deck guns. They've removed the Nazi symbolism. I'm not saying it should be restored, but it's not there anymore. So it's certainly been modified. And more importantly, it's out of context. It's in a basement of the museum. It has nothing to do with the sea anymore. It might have had more context if it was tied up on a pier someplace. So does U-505 meet the integrity standard? In some ways, it does, like any cultural art resource, if it has integrity of association or has any association. Well, it clearly does have association, but physically, it's questionable whether it has integrity. So I'm just going to close the discussion of integrity by stating that I just don't think it's helpful to have an integrity standard, and particularly one that would allow the veto of certain historic resources that are no longer represent in physical form what they were. Again, under the ship of Theseus standard, I mean, every physical building particularly suffers deterioration and replacement, and nothing is in the exact condition or maintains integrity from where it was. So the question is, how far can it be deviated from its original condition and be considered to have integrity? Let me change subjects now to guidelines. And you should know that your guidelines, and there are plenty, apply not to the designation, but to the preservation, rehabilitation, and restoration, and particularly certificates of appropriateness. So Section 289 of your ordinances incorporate the Secretary's standards for treatment of properties. And those are standards, but they also have guidelines. And I do note that Evanston and the Commission has two specific sets of guidelines for windows and for solar panels. Let me see if I can get a screenshot of your ordinances to show you where that occurs. So hold on a second. Let's see if I can do that. Okay, let's go down to 289. Everybody see your ordinance on the screen? Okay. So I know you're all familiar with it, but here's the standards for review of applications for certificates of appropriateness. And in a contrast to the criteria, which says that you have to limit your consideration to the criteria, the 10 criteria plus one, you are told you shall consider, whatever that means, only the following general standards, specific design guidelines, which you may not have except for windows and solar panels, and the standards included in subsection E of this section, which is the Secretary of Standards. And again, it's referred to in each of the certificates of appropriation that might be before the commission: standards for construction, relocation, again, subsection 289E, standards for review of demolition. And it makes it very clear, once again, in subsection E, that the commission shall also consider, whatever that means, the Secretary of Interior standards for treatment of historic properties. So what are the Secretary standards? So let me ask a question. How many are there? Nick knows. Okay, thank you, Nick. Anybody else can tell me how many standards?
They are very similar to the standards for the criteria for, the standards for alteration, construction, relocation, demolition. So those standards were based on the Secretary of Interior standards. And they have been modified over time. So our ordinance has not kept up with that necessarily, but they are very similar in terms of what they call for.
Well, okay, you are directed to consider the Secretary standards. So how many are there? There are 4 or perhaps 5. So let me see if we can find. So I mean, and here's a topic, and I'll show you how many there are. But I did want to show you what this is a screenshot from the National Park Service, and we talked about narrow or broad guidelines. And I just wanted to show you what the guidelines are for designation of properties under the National Register of Historic Places. And so I don't know how many there are, a couple of dozen: how to apply, how to complete, guidelines for evaluating cemeteries, aids to navigation, historic aviation properties. I mean, when I said thousands of pages, I wasn't kidding, of thousands of pages of guidelines of how you apply the National Register criteria. And my question is, where does that stand on the spectrum of the due process? If they are intended to be followed, how deep do you have to get? How broad should those be? And as a matter of fact, how do they actually apply? So I've got a screenshot of the first page of one of the bulletins, the guidelines for evaluating, documenting traditional cultural properties. What is the meaning of this set of guidelines? And this is for the application of the criteria for placement on the National Register. What does it say about it? And then it says, no one should regard this bulletin as the only appropriate source of guidance on its subject or interpret it rigidly. What is the meaning of it? This is, as it says at the end, this is not a substitute for more specific guidelines, such as those used by the Park Service or those used by some other agency, states, local government, or Indian tribes with respect to their own lands or programs. How in the world are you supposed to look at these guidelines when they tell you they aren't rigidly applied? They're not the only source, and there's other things out there that might apply. It's a conundrum, and as a lawyer, I say guidelines, we just don't know how to apply it. If I were a property owner, I would look at this and throw up my hands and say, I don't know what applies. So here's another screenshot out of the National Park Service, and it tells you that there are 4 secretary standards. They're preservation, rehabilitation, restoration, and reconstruction. Okay, which ones apply? There's also a 5th one. There's actually 2 standards for rehabilitation. So it applies, it says, for the historic tax incentive program. And he says that the 2 versions of the rehabilitation standards convey the same intent and provide the same guidance. They do, although they are worded slightly differently, and shall replaces will in the 1995 version. Well, I've looked at the 2 versions and they are similar, but the wording is different. And are we to ignore the 5th standard under 36 CFR Part 67? Are you to ignore that, or do you apply the 4 or the 5? When do you apply preservation? When do you apply the standard for rehabilitation? When for restoration, and when for reconstruction? Maybe in some cases it's obvious. What's the difference between preservation and rehabilitation? I'm not an expert, so maybe the experts can tell me. And so finally, let me get out of this and give you a live screenshot if I can. Let's see, I think this is it. So here is a live screenshot of the National Park Service description of the 4 standards for rehabilitation. So if you look over on the left-hand column, you have standards for rehabilitation. So you have the 4 standards plus the 5th one, the double one for standards of rehabilitation. And you have guidelines that attempt to tell you how the standards apply. And so here's one I love. Guidelines for treatment. Let's see, that's called, let's see if I can find it. Okay, here's the guidelines for the treatment of historic properties. So this incorporates the 4. Okay, so here's what comes up on the screen. The Secretary's Interior standards for all 4 of them: preserving, rehabilitating, and reconstructing. So I just want to give you an idea of the extent of these. So here are the standards, and we have total of more than 240 pages of guidelines for each of the standards. Here's reconstructing in the light blue, restoration, rehabilitation, and preservation. So when do you apply rehabilitation? When do you apply preservation? I don't know the answer to that, and I'm not sure they do. Are the standards different for each of those? I don't know the answer to that. So here they're telling us what the purpose is. It's always, let's see, the guidelines are intended as an aid to assist in applying the standards to all types of building. It is not meant to give case-specific advice. And let's go back one screen. And what does it say? Is that big enough? The guidelines are advisory, not regulatory. So the question, I suppose, for the Evanston Commission is, you are told in the ordinance to consider the standards. Do you ignore the guidelines? How do you apply them? And this is something for which I don't have an answer. And maybe Nick can help us out on that. So that concludes my remarks. I guess I'm in under the deadline. And if you have any questions, I'm happy to consider them. And again, thanks very much for having me and letting me vent on what I think of standards and guidelines.
Thank you, Richard. I guess we can open to questions at this time. Anybody has any questions for Richard?
I guess I'll ask a question. Or, I'm sorry, Jaleka, you have one? No, okay, all right. So back to the integrity issue for cultural and historic landmarks. One of the things we struggled with was, we were trying to focus on in the, Evanston Black community, but, kind of honoring places of historic and cultural significance. And I know, and the first thing that came before us, like in 2018, was the landmarking of the Foster School, which we did landmark based on historical significance to the community. The building itself had been large, often added to and destroyed by fire. So there was not much historic integrity, but there was at least a little. The next thing we did is Aleka and I worked on assisting with how to honor and preserve African-American historic sites in Evanston. And it had lots of historic and cultural integrity. You probably could have fit it within the ordinance because of its associations, as you pointed out. But the community felt that because it didn't have architectural integrity, they thought it was a really bad idea to submit it to the preservation ordinance. And I think one of the things it does, I think one of the things we struggled with in these is, yes, we do want to honor these things because of their historic and cultural integrity, but it may be a bad thing for the advocates of this, because then they're stuck with a preservation framework which focuses on maintaining the architectural integrity and restricting modifications, which is really not what the people were after. And so, on the one hand, we have a community we're trying to do outreach to who feel that they want their history and culture honored. The other problem is, though, if we do, is the historic preservation ordinance a good way of doing it, or is it kind of restrictions they don't want? So I don't know if that's something that you've struggled with or have any thoughts on.
Well, I think there are two things you want to think about. And then one is to address the problems that you told us about. You might want to consider redrafting the criteria to allow for the designation of cultural resources that are not necessarily tied to a particular bricks and mortar building. But on the other hand, I think you do have an opportunity under your current ordinance to, under the rubric of association, say that a cultural resource like that does have association, and there's no reason that the ordinance designating it could say that no permit application need be submitted to the commission, or at least the commission shall not consider the current improvements or something of that sort that would not require for that particular landmark would not require a review of the physical building.
So I was going to ask a similar question, which had to do with the traditional cultural properties National Register guidelines that you had up. Because I wonder if there are, I have myself personally applied the traditional cultural properties guidelines to a project in the past. So I'm a little familiar with those. And I wonder if there is some way, or there are any criteria, local criteria, that are based on the traditional cultural properties idea that we could use as a model here, or some guidance. The ones that you had up, they were not up long enough for me to see whether the TCP were included. But that might help us, because those don't, the TCP isn't really connected to architecture.
Well, exactly. And so I think under your current 10+1 criteria, you do have plenty of opportunities. You might want to consider a review of expansion, modernizing and updating the criteria to make it much more apparent to everybody what you want to designate, and adapting them to the current conditions.
Anybody else? Lisa?
Lisa's got it.
Hi, sorry, I was going to write this in the chat room, but I saw the chat was disabled, so I just thought I'd raise my hand. Just so everyone knows, and since Richard used the Muddy Waters House as the example, because Landmarks Illinois is very involved in the advocacy efforts around the Muddy Waters House, I'm working directly with the great-granddaughter of Muddy Waters, Shonda Cooper, who's the owner of the house, and her nonprofit is fundraising to do the rehabilitation to make it a house museum and a place open to the public ultimately. That we have, just to clarify, the Muddy Waters House actually currently is a contributing protected property within the North Kenwood multiple property district. So Muddy Waters House already technically has the protections afforded it through Chicago landmark designation, already has to go through permit review for any work done to the building on the exterior, et cetera. We, in discussions with the staff of the Historic Preservation Division of the city, decided to still create a new overlay individual landmark designation for the building that is actually going forward at the Commission on Chicago Landmarks meeting on Thursday, June 3rd, if any of you want to tune into it, because you can, just like I am here with your meeting, which is usually at 12:45 on June 3rd, where they will hear that nomination. And what's the reason we all agreed it would make sense is because the multiple property historic district for North Kenwood, its period of significance ends basically at 1920 or something. So obviously now the most important period of history associated with that building was Muddy Waters residency, which was in the 60s into the 70s until he died. And he made changes to the building. He made some very significant changes to the porch, to the front doorway, to the cornice, to the bay area, the bay window area. So we all agreed that in this new individual landmark designation, this isn't that the building's lost its integrity. Its history changed, its aesthetic changed under the hands of its most famous owner. And so what will happen in this new designation that you'll hear the preliminary vote for by the commission on the 3rd of June is they will spell out specifically in that designation report these new protected elements, which in the traditional world of historic preservation, a commission like yours, a commission like the Commission on Chicago Landmarks would have never allowed in the first place way back, because he took out the wood structure of the porch and replaced it with metal railings. He changed the door. So it's a really interesting discussion from the perspective of how we have to continue to address these properties going forward about what its actual period of significance and its change at what time and under what circumstances. So anyway, I just encourage you all, if you have 12:45 open on June 3rd, to tune into the Commission on Chicago Landmarks meeting as they discuss the Muddy Waters individual designation, this new overlay and change to it.
Thank you, Lisa. Anybody else? I think Stuart.
Yeah, it sort of sounds like the properties have to be taken individually. I mean, one of the problems that I have with all of this is that when the designation is as a cultural or historic landmark, that in a sense, the integrity of the architecture in which that cultural association or historic event is associated becomes really problematic. I really liked Richard's XKE Jaguar, and as a midpoint on a continuum, it brings to mind things like the reconstruction of Williamsburg, things like probably the reconstruction or the rebuilding anew of the Barcelona Pavilion by Svanborough, which is an entirely new building, but was considered to be, or is considered to be, one of the landmarks of 20th century modernism. And then finally, the thing that came to mind when Richard was speaking, and I don't even know how you would categorize this, but one of the prime locations of the Shinto religion, which is the Ise Shrine in Japan, is rebuilt every, I believe it's 70 years on an adjacent site. They take down the original thing and they build an entirely new, accurate replica of it on an adjacent site. So that, as you point out, none of the original material is there, yet the rebuilding and renewal of this thing is part of a religious ritual.
Yeah, good point. So my point is, I'm not sure that integrity lobe of the criteria is really helpful and might be counterproductive. Or
Yeah,
irrelevant.
I think you make a good case for that.
I just wanted to point out that the traditional cultural properties would encompass that because it has to do with the activity that's associated with the site. So the rebuilding, and using Stuart's excellent example, which actually occurred to me too when Richard was talking, would, you know, like that the rebuilding activity would be the thing that is the you know, gives it significance, if that makes sense.
So would you landmark the totally new building, which is a replica of the 1929 pavilion?
Right.
Anybody else have any questions?
What-
Yes, Aleka.
One, and this is just maybe wishful or esoteric or whatever, but one thing that I always, or that I've been fighting with, I mean, years ago, I worked within the federal tax credit program. And so we were using the standards and very definitely looking just at the buildings, you know, and now comparing that to when you're working in as a historic commission, I guess I always think of, you know, and legally, I guess this doesn't exist. Maybe that's my question. It's like, kind of, what is our mission? Why do we exist? You know, is, if it's to preserve Evanston's unique character and yada, 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 like we say on our website, what does that mean? Is there any, I guess, can we define that, or are we just limited to the various standards? Because if our mission is to preserve our unique character, then that folds in all the cultural things and the landscape things and things like that. And is there a way of doing that, or a shift to doing that? I mean, I guess I find like the mission at where we are very different from applying preservation in different scenarios. I think that a historic commission and a small city level, or any city level, is like, on the one hand, it's the individual buildings, but on the other hand, it's the unique character of the city overall. And what does that mean? How do you get to that legally?
Well, it's a good point. And things happen that are outside the framework of legalities. And I think what's happened is we all recognize that historic preservation has changed. And I gave you the four, I guess, trends in the goals of historic preservation. And in the last decade, they certainly have changed. And we want to recognize our diversity and want to recognize our previously unheralded cultural resources. And your ordinances and goal as given by the city council do seem sufficient to allow you to do that and to follow what the community is directing. And it certainly would be helpful to review the ordinance and review the criteria and see whether they couldn't be updated.
Anybody else? Any questions? Okay, do you have any comments or questions?
I don't have any specific questions for Richard. I think he makes a lot of really good points. I will, there's that section, if you were to nominate something and designate it, where you can craft your own guidelines for the property. I think that's very important for these cultural resources. If we were to move forward, is that you can really start to pinpoint what's important about it and what the review process in the future should be. I also think there's some good examples, like you said, in the designating ordinance. You could say that maybe it's only reviewed for like demolition review. That you're not going to review it for alteration or construction, but these specific properties will only become in front of the commission if they're proposed to be demolished. And then I think the other thing is there's just a big, and it goes back kind of to what Aleka was saying and what Mark was saying, is that I don't think the community at large understands fully the tools that they have and the tools that are afforded to them in the preservation ordinance. And I think there's a misunderstanding about what the commission does and what the ordinance does, and that it's entirely regulatory and based in resource management. And that's not necessarily true. I think it has a lot more potential, and it is largely maybe up to Carlos and myself, but also the commissioners to just speak more broadly and try to educate the community at large, and also the city council to the potential that preservation has for our city.
Sure. Anybody else? I'd like to continue just with some comments of the things that we've done in Evanston. So Richard, I think you have a great point to discuss the Secretary of Interior standards. But the way the commission has treated those is when, for instance, there's a situation where our standards may not cover certain aspects of a nomination, and then we refer to the national standards if there's anything there that will help the commission to understand better. So when it's necessary, we went to the Secretary of Interior standards, to see if there's anything else that we can use in our report for purposes of landmark designation, or even the review of certain projects for alteration or construction, relocation and demolition. So the commission has not necessarily ignored that, but I think that in most cases the standards do apply, and we can resolve the situations where in most cases are approvable. So I think that we're doing the best we can under current ordinance, but I think that obviously it would be difficult to go back every single time to the Secretary standards when we already have the tools in our current ordinance, which is the local preservation of resources. The National Register obviously has a higher level of recognition. It's very honorary, but it's the highest recognition you can get, being a national landmark, for instance. But it's not protected by a local ordinance. The other thing that you talk about is diversity. And in the recent few days, we attended the American Planning Association workshop. And one thing that stand out to me was that, yes, we are moving towards diversity, but the other thing that they talk about is to be inclusive. In other words, if you have a population that has a diversity in different ethnic backgrounds, and let's say, we're trying to do the same like with the commission diversity, but we're not including other people. And it's not because of lack of interest, is that we seem to hit this wall where people who would like to reach out are not coming forward, or we're not digging enough, deep enough to find people like that. So it's very important to remember that our intentions are spelled out in the ordinance. We just have to recognize that certain situations limit the ability to include everybody. It's not that we don't want to include everybody. And the situation of recognizing the African-American sites and individuals, I thought that was a great initiative. The commission was involved to assist the people that were interested in doing that. Alderman from the 5th Ward and Dina Robinson were the primary two people that we worked with. And one thing that we did not do, and now thinking what you just said, Richard, that when we create a landmark to protect it, when we talk about the guidelines is not only to preserve that, we can say this building could be modified as long as, we preserve what's the most part of the history of the building, or we did that partially with the school that we designated it. It was altered so many times, but it was part of the history of the site and the building as well. So we integrated how the history changed to what it is, that building now. But I think we had to be more alert about these guidelines. And it will depend on a case by case situation, because there will be buildings that have good integrity, but at the same time, buildings are built in a way that they will not always last forever, and things will change over time. And we are allowing alterations, we are allowing additions. So we are kind of making that building somewhat different. It's not the same anymore with an addition with a window that is extra or something in a particular elevation, but we're looking at is the overall appearance. Does it change so much that you no longer recognize that building? Yeah, the same situation that this here described with the altering a building, or in this case the ship. There was those analogies like you have the knife. One time the owner comes and changes the blade, and the next time he comes changes the handle. So do you have the knife, the same knife? And the answer is no. Might look the same, but it's not the same knife, right? So I don't think we're doing that, but I think the other aspect of it is that, and I heard this late in the recent few days as well, that we are managing change rather than stopping people from doing things. We're managing. So we're trying to contain certain things that might be detrimental to the building, would not be appropriate, would be not sensitive, but we're still allowing change. So that's part then of the history of that particular building. It will become part of the history of that particular building. And I think that gives a little bit more latitude and not be so close-minded about things. Anyway, that's my thoughts. Anybody else have anything to add about this section? And anybody else have any discussion?
I have just a very quick question for Kay and Carlos. For landmark nominations, are in Evanston, are they required to have the list of character defining features?
Well, I think that they should submit that. They should submit because it will be a more complete application.
But it's not obligatory.
No, the standard
Okay.
says that you have to meet at least one of the criteria. It doesn't say as many as possible.
No, I mean the character defining features of the building, like what aspects of the building are defined are associated with.
I think that will improve the nomination.
I think, Sarah, what you're asking, it's one of the requirements of the report that the commission has to put together.
Right, that's what I was asking. So there's always a list of the character defining features, the things that make the building historic. So those can be modified. Those can be, determined on a case-by-case basis so that we have the flexibility. Okay, that's all I was asking.
Yeah.
Great.
Yeah, and that's important to remember because in Evanston, we have the Lakes Historic District that has a good number of very important buildings designed by important architects. There are mansions, some of them. And then we have in the west side of Evanston, very modest landmarks, farmhouses and the like. So you cannot necessarily compare, well, that's not a landmark, like Richard was saying at the beginning of his presentation about someone trying to nominate a building in a particular ward. It's what the community makes of the resources, right? Are we recognizing not only the famous architects, we're recognizing the culture, we're recognizing the history, we're recognizing sites, we're recognizing people. So I think that makes it broader and easier to identify resources. My last thought is that sometimes when people are not necessarily preservation minded, they kind of attack commissions or preservationists when they say, well, now everything can become a landmark. So you don't have a threshold. and they criticize because, you know, it seems like everything is landmark to them. But I mean, that's the criticism I hear from time to time. Okay.
And just one more quick question or clarification. In historic districts, I mean, the districts have criteria, or not criteria, each different district has a listing of why that district is nominated and why it's a district and what within that district we want to preserve. So that could guide us to more cultural or, you know, things beyond just built materials.
Yes. More important to remember is that both the Lakeshore Historic District and the Ridge Historic District were originally the National Register Historic Districts, those first two. And when the ordinance was adopted, the current ordinance in 1994, those districts became local districts with no further review or make it more local. It just became local as is. So, you know, and then that's why we have the resurvey of the Lakeshore Historic District in 2000, I believe it's 2013. And that helped us to kind of bring information of the buildings that are in the district that had changed over time, because that was nominated back in 1990. So it's important to keep up with the changes as well over time.
And that can be particularly tricky in terms of how these districts evolve in their evolutionary history. I know that occasionally, and I'm sure Carlos can talk to it too, but someone will ask us why they can't do something on the building's listed as non-contributing, or it's not within the period of significance. But in both the Ridge and the Lakeshore districts, you know, they have very significant interventions that happened in the 50s and 60s that might be listed as non-contributing. Some were constructed by significant architects. So I think we're lucky in a way that our ordinance doesn't discern, it doesn't draw a line between how to treat contributing versus non-contributing structures. But it's just something to think about. It's certainly a challenge.
Yeah.
And it goes back a little to what Lisa talked about. I mean, we wouldn't necessarily have to individually landmark those properties to afford them the same protections just because they're outside the period of significance. And I think that's important.
What I learned is that when the volunteers back in the 70s were putting together the list of landmarks to the National Register, there were so many that the state told them, no, we're not going to do individual landmarking. You should think about historic district. That's what it became, a historic district, because there were too many important buildings. And that was the same treatment for the Ridge Historic District. And yes, there are buildings within the district that are outside the period of significance. And of course, they are subject to the same standards, but I think the commission and staff, we know what the ordinance calls for, so that my experience has been that if a building is not contributing, the commission would not put the same weight on the standards. And every time that happens, they always say, we're not trying to set a precedent. This is for this particular building that is not contributing. You know, they may allow something that may not be appropriate for a landmark, but it's still compatible with the district or with the building itself, but it's not the same as a landmark building. Okay, so anybody else? We can move to Nick, and I'll let Kate now take over. I'm sorry, I want to thank Richard. I'm sorry again. I want to thank Richard. Richard, are you going to be able to stay, or you need to?
I can stay till about noon or so, and I do want to hear Nick. So
okay,
happy.
All right, but thank you so much, Richard,
Okay.
for your presentation.
My pleasure, and thank you.
Thanks, Richard. I had the opportunity to work with our next speaker for about 4 years, and I don't want to say he taught me everything I know, but he taught me maybe the majority of what I know. So our next speaker is Nick Calgarisis. He's a principal at a multidisciplinary planning firm in Chicago called the Lakota Group. And Nick leads their preservation and comprehensive plan portfolios. Before he started working at the Lakota Group, Nick worked for the National Trust for Historic Preservation. He was a Main Street manager in their Main Street program. And from there, take it away, Nick.
Great. Thanks, Cade. It's a pleasure to be with all of you today. It's good to see a few familiar faces. And yes, I had the great opportunity to work with Cade for a few years. Was sad to see him go to Evanston. You're lucky to have him. And it's good to see Richard here. Richard and I are actually working on a project in Mesa, Arizona. So we know Richard and I know each other very well. And I had the distinct pleasure to work with the city of Evanston on their landmark inventory back in 2015, I guess. So I know Evanston fairly well. So for today, I just have a very general presentation about design guidelines and why communities adopt or prepare and adopt customized design guidelines for their communities and why it's worthwhile doing that. And how does it relate to the Secretary of Interior standards or other standards that we may be using when we conduct our design review responsibilities as a commission. So I just want to go over that and then show you a couple of examples of design guidelines we've worked on with other client communities in the past. So just to give you an understanding of how they're put together and what's inside them and things like that. So I did not get a chance to look at your preservation code before this presentation. So hopefully I'm not going to, say some wrong things here. But I do want to build on what Richard said in his presentation and add to that a little bit more. So let's get my presentation up. Assume everyone could see that. Let's see. All right. Okay. All right. Just to talk about design guidelines. And as I've said, it's a document that many communities put together to build on any standards that they have adopted for design review and certificate appropriateness reviews. There are many different types of design guidelines out there that communities adopt, and there are design guidelines specifically for historic preservation that communities adopt. And when communities or clients ask me, what's the difference between design standards and guidelines, not to kind of confuse you with what Richard talked about in his presentation, but this is what I explain to communities, what's the difference between the two. And to me, historic preservation design standards are commonly accepted goals for the treatment of historic properties. That's the way I like to say it. They're commonly accepted goals. And, they're in different industries, there are standards that are out there, and usually there's some professional body that's going to come up with standards that all of the professionals have to follow. In the case of historic preservation, it's the National Park Service and the Department of Interior that came up with the Secretary of Interior standards. And they actually go back a ways, even to the early 70s, but it wasn't until 1976 that the first set of the Secretary of Interior standards were created. And why? In 1976 is when the US Congress passed the Tax Reform Act of 1976, introducing the Historic Preservation Tax Credit Program. So the National Park Service, which manages the program in partnership with state historic preservation offices, needed a set of standards to judge projects that were seeking the tax credits. So the first generation of those standards were in 1976. But it wasn't until 1985 that the standards that we use today in the preservation field came to its current state, basically. And so in 1985 is when the Department of Interior, the National Park Service, came out with what are 4 sets of standards for historic preservation. There's standards for how do we treat properties, historic buildings or buildings in historic districts or whatever, cultural resource properties. But there are 4 standards, and I'm not going to go into all of them in this presentation. But the second one, the standards for rehabilitation, is the one that is very commonly used by local communities as their set design standards. I believe that's what the city of Chicago uses, is the 10 standards. And that's it. That's all they use when they do their permit reviews. And it's what, as I've said, the National Park Service uses to evaluate historic preservation tax credit projects. Now, each of these standards, as I'm sure you know, they have a different approach. The standards for preservation is if you're going to take a property and you're not going to do much with it, you're going to preserve it. You're not going to add an addition. You're just going to preserve it for the long term. So there are sets of standards for that. The standards for rehabilitation is, and one of the reasons why it's commonly used, is that it's really kind of focused on adapting properties for the future. How do we adapt it over the long term? So you could have a big commercial building, may have housed a department store at one time, and we're going to adapt it into apartments or whatever housing. So these are the standards that are commonly used in most community design guidelines today, because it represents flexibility and adaptability. And then standards for restoration is if you're going to take a property back to a certain date, to when it was first constructed. These are standards for how to restore the property. And then the last one, reconstruction, is if you're going to reconstruct a missing building or a missing element in the building. This provides some standards for that. Now, there are communities, I come across a few of them once in a while, that use all 4 of these standards in their design review. Very rare. The one city that I know of that uses all 4 is the city of San Antonio. They use all 4 of them in their design review. But like I said, I think in most cases, most communities use the Secretary of the standards for rehabilitation. So design guidelines, you have standards, the common goals, but guidelines to me are the preferred treatments to meet or achieve that standard. So what are the treatment approaches that we are going to require people to go through a certificate of appropriateness review that they have to meet a standard? So guidelines just illustrate, they explain, they describe how do we meet those standards. So just for an instance, why design guidelines why we need to have design guidelines is that, first of all, here's an example. The first standard for the standards for rehabilitation: a property shall be used for its historic purpose and be placed in new use that requires minimal change to the defining characteristics of the building and its site and environment. So the critical question, if I'm a property owner and I'm reading that, what does minimal change mean? Okay. What are the defining characteristics? So if we put ourselves in the place of a property owner or homeowner and they're trying to interpret these standards, what are those? What does that mean? What is minimal change? What is defining characteristics? So that's why we have design guidelines, is to answer some of these questions for property owners as they plan their projects going forward. So communities use design guidelines. Obviously, the first bullet point is the most common purpose. We use it for our COA review process for landmarks and historic districts. That's why we develop it. It's mainly the use for our commission, but they can be used for other purposes. The second one is you may have an incentive program locally, a facade improvement program, and you may need some guidelines to help decide whether or not a project is appropriate for a particular building in exchange for getting an incentive or a grant. So you have to meet those guidelines. And then third, I think most importantly, is educating building owners on proper maintenance and preservation procedures. And so they're not just looked at as some regulatory document. They should be looked at as a manual for property owners to be able to plan their projects out appropriately. So it has an educational function to them. Excuse me. And then most of all, design guidelines should be an accessible document. It shouldn't be buried in an ordinance somewhere. It should always be an accessible document off a website so that people who want access to this information can get it. So try to make it as accessible as possible. And basically, there are two types of design guidelines for historic preservation. One, they could be geared toward individual historic district, maybe a downtown historic district or an individual neighborhood, where you may want these design guidelines to address particular issues found in those districts. So, and then you could have a comprehensive set of design guidelines that address common rehabilitation, preservation issues across all districts and landmarks. And so the second one is more common in a lot of communities, especially smaller communities. The bigger the community, you could have lots of larger cities will have individual design guidelines tailored to specific historic districts. And what's inside a set of design guidelines? These are common components to a set of design guidelines. One is, you'll have a section that describes the architecture of the community, the historic architecture of the community. You could have information about individual historic districts. Basically, you want to be able to tell the reader what's special about your historic buildings. What are some of the common architectural features, landscape features, and things like that. And then the second and third bullet points, or actually the fourth bullet points, are really the more common elements of a set of design guidelines. One is you'll have a section on building maintenance and preservation. I'll talk more about these in slides going forward. Building additions for commercial and residential institutional buildings. And then new construction within historic districts, new home, new commercial building. How do we fit it in within a historic district? And then landscape and site features, signage, and increasingly a focus on green design in historic buildings, how to incorporate green design elements. And then the last couple points there, you may have a set of definitions, because not a lot of people are going to understand like what an architrave or a portico means. So you may have a set of definitions to describe that, and then a list of additional information resources that somebody could access. And then last but not least, some communities address how do we treat contributing and non-contributing resources. There are communities that really kind of they fine tune what you can do to non-contributing properties. So anyway, these are all kind of like basic design, basic elements of design guidelines. And just to dive a little bit deeper, on building maintenance and preservation, obviously we're going to get into two main things. One is building materials. How do we preserve existing materials? How do we rehabilitate them if they show some sign of wear and tear? Or how do we do replacement in a way that maintains the integrity of the property? And the same thing goes for architectural features. You can go, a lot of design guidelines will get into in depth on how do you treat porches, roofs, storefronts, ornamentation, you name it. As much as you want to address specific features found in your historic districts, you can add that and describe it as much as you can. And so the basic thing you want to be able to describe in design guidelines are what is acceptable and what is not acceptable when it comes to building materials and architectural features. And then on building additions and new construction, guidelines will get into things like how do you place additions or new construction on a building or a lot, and then you can get into a lot more detail on particular architectural styles. For instance, adding an addition to a craftsman bungalow will be a lot different than adding an addition to a Queen Anne house. So how do you address placement of new additions? And then getting into materials, height, massing, and scale, fenestration, and then garages and accessory structures. And again, what's acceptable and what's not acceptable in our historic districts. And so that's what we're trying to answer in design guidelines. And then landscape and site features, trees and general landscaping, paths, patios, fencing, driveways, and then some communities will get into sidewalks in the public right of way, not so much that the commission's going to regulate what happens in the public right of way, but it may serve as some guidance and management to your public works department and how to treat how do they treat the public right of way in historic districts. And then again, it's what's acceptable and what's not acceptable in these areas. And then last but not least, signage, where are they placed on commercial buildings? What materials are appropriate? And then addressing historic signage. How do we treat and maintain historic signage if we're regulating historic signage in our districts? And again, what's acceptable and what's not acceptable. So that's kind of my short presentation on design guidelines. I just wanted to kind of show you, an example set of design guidelines. Let's see. Let me see if I get this up. So can everybody see that? Okay, the decal. I'm just going to show a couple examples. I think the one benefit of historic design guidelines is being able to illustrate them with images and photos to explain people, how the design guidelines work. A few years ago, we did a set of design guidelines for downtown DeKalb, Illinois. And the reason why they wanted a set of design guidelines, actually their downtown was not listed in the National Register, nor was it a local historic district, but they developed a facade improvement program where they wanted to emphasize historic preservation. And so we were hired to develop these design guidelines. And it's very basic and straightforward. And one of the, these are basically how a set of design guidelines are, kind of set up. And again, having a section on architecture, describing what are parts of a commercial building and showing some images. And again, getting into defining characteristics of what we're trying to preserve in the downtown. So in this set of design guidelines, we did emphasize quite a lot on what the existing architecture is. And so we had an extensive chapter on styles, explaining what are the defining features of each of these styles. A lot of great Queen Anne commercial in downtown DeKalb that we wanted to point out to people. And a lot of very simple buildings, and how do we treat some of the more simpler vernacular commercial buildings in the downtown. So we went through and described almost all the major architectural styles found in the downtown. And again, illustrating them with some good images. Downtown DeKalb has some really great, diversity in its architecture, going all the way into the 1950s and 60s. And then obviously, again, here's, a section on building maintenance and exterior building maintenance, and having a series of photographs that show what you should be doing, what you should, and then the X's are what you should not be doing. And it's all explained in the text. So, and again, all on building materials, how do we repoint masonry? How do we clean terracotta? There's a lot of terracotta in downtown DeKalb, and getting into storefronts. So very straightforward. Windows being a big issue in almost every community. And then, diving down a lot more on storefronts in this commercial area. So anyway, and then getting into signage and awnings, and then having some illustrations that show where signage should take place on a commercial building, and then showing, basically some fenestration, infill design, and then again, having a set of definitions. And then we did base the set of design guidelines on the Secretary of Interior standards for rehabilitation. So I'm going to show a little bit of design guidelines we're working on. Let's see if I can find it. Let's see. Okay. All right. We, as I said, Richard and I are actually working on a set of design guidelines for Mesa, Arizona. And just illustrating, DeKalb was focused on downtown. This is a set of design guidelines that will be used for all the historic districts in Mesa. So one of the things I just wanted to point out in this set of design guidelines, not to go into any too great detail. First of all, I want to say this is a draft. So I probably shouldn't be showing this set, but because we're going to be revising it. But we do have a section on treatment options in here. This is a community where they were open to using all 4 of the Secretary of Interior standards, preservation all the way through reconstruction. And so we describe the standards and then how does it apply in design review. And then we do have a section in here on all the architecture and historic properties in Mesa. So we have a good history on the development of Mesa. And then we get into individual historic districts. And within here, we point out some of the major character features of each of the historic districts, their natural features, their layout, lots, architectural characteristics. So we get into a lot of detail on how each of these districts, their main features. And the reason being is that in Mesa, they wanted us to really explore those character defining features in the districts, and to use this as a background information for property owners or developers who are looking to try to figure out how do they fit in new construction in these historic districts. So anyway, that's all I have. I just wanted to give kind of a brief overview of design guidelines and how do they look and what goes inside them. So, any questions?
I have a question.
Sure.
I liked how you showed the 2, examples, like one was more specific of the downtown, one was more comprehensive with everything. Who set that goal for you when you were creating those? Was it the Preservation Commission? Was it the listings, the national listings that you had, or how did you determine what the focus would be?
Well, each community we work with is different, how they want to approach their design guidelines. In Mesa, well, first of all, Mesa is totally different from Evanston. Mesa has only does administrative review of, they only do administrative review and nothing really goes up to their commission. So we're not going to be really very heavy on, there's not a very heavy regulatory aspect of it. So, but just to answer your question, each community kind of tells us what their parameters are for their design guidelines and how much they want, how much in-depth information they want, how much design guidelines do they want, what are some specific issues that they want addressed. And so, so each community is different. There are some communities that, want very in-depth design guidelines and some that want very short and brief design guidelines.
But do the, like city council, aldermen, that level ever get involved in?
It depends. In Mesa, yes, the city manager and the mayor are involved in it. They're very heavily involved. We're currently doing a set of design guidelines for Joliet, and Joliet we're just working with their staff on it and their commission. So we don't think we're going to get any more involvement on the city's part than that. So it just depends. We're doing Mesa right now, and we had to do an extensive community engagement process with it because they wanted this to be an opportunity to talk to their property owners in their historic districts about the design guidelines and what the intent is. So we had to do, actually, we did like 3 months of interviews with people just to talk to them about what the design guidelines are going to be about and how do they see them using it, and what are particular issues they're facing as property owners. So it just depends, what each community wants to do.
Nick, may I ask, oh, I'm sorry, go ahead, Lisa. I was just going to ask a quick follow-up question about your interviews. Did the property owners that you were talking to, did they know what the character defining features were of their own properties?
Some did and some didn't, and I think, the city saw it as an opportunity to talk to people, and talk about, what's important, what type of architecture they have, and why it's important to try to manage what happens in those districts. And so I would say in a lot of cases, we did open some eyes to people about, like in Mesa, the ranch home is really important. A lot of, post 1950s development there. And to them, the ranch home's pretty ubiquitous. There's nothing special about it, but it is there. They are the historic neighborhoods in Mesa. And so trying to explain why the ranch home was so important to try to preserve, it did open up some eyes on property owners. And then there are property owners who want to maintain, investment in their neighborhoods. And then there are property owners who are really scared about, oh, what's the city going to do to me? So it was an opportunity to explain and describe things to them.
This is Lisa again from Landmarks Illinois, and thank you again for letting me eavesdrop on your conversation here, because it's always a good refresher for me to hear Richard and Nick as well. But one thing I wanted to point out that is, sometimes an interesting scenario is, for instance, in Chicago, when they designated the Fulton Market Historic District, which, as most of you know, is this district of former and still in some cases current food-related warehouses that are going through this big transition in terms of a very trendy commercial residential neighborhood now. And so when the Commission on Chicago Landmarks and the staff developed that historic district, they set a very specific set of design guidelines for that district because it's so different in nature. And they knew going forward that their review process was going to be different in nature because so many of these warehouse buildings, going back to the integrity issue, had been changed over the years in a lot of different ways, because these are just, these are buildings that had hard uses. And so one thing to keep in mind is you can think about design guidelines in the future is they work with developers and property owners in that district based on these design guidelines, but those design guidelines may not be adaptable to to a developer wanting to use the federal historic tax credits. So when the city had that district designated, they also had it certified with the National Park Service so that a developer would have the option to use the federal historic tax credits. But there may be definitely things that the city would accept in terms of changes to the historic buildings, but the SPO and the Park Service absolutely will not. So it has to be made very clear to property owners and in these types of public meetings, we may be coming up as a local community with some very adaptable and more flexible types of design guidelines for this very specific district because we think it makes sense. And you can apply for our own local types of historic incentives. In this case, Class L can still work for projects with designated Chicago landmarks, but it doesn't mean you're going to get a federal historic tax credit. So that sort of differential has to really be made clear for homeowners and property owners. I could see that being the case in a place like Evanston, like with the property tax assessment freeze incentive, that if you developed a design guidelines that you thought were more flexible for residents, it has to be made clear you're going to have another very set of more strict review with the SHPO, with seeking an incentive like that. So just something to keep in mind.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. We tried it, well, we haven't yet with Mesa, but in DeKalb, we did consult with the SHPO's office. You know, we asked them to take a look at it. So just to get their feedback. So that is a thing you have to be aware of. Those state and federal incentives.
If I might add to that topic of the local standards versus the federal and how that benefit the applicant, what we do as staff in Evanston is we let the person know when they, for instance, want to replace windows. We let them know that if they are with the Landmarks Illinois facade program, or if they think to apply for the assessment freeze, then the thing they need to do is restore rather than replace, unless the replacement is necessary. But the ordinance in Evanston is similar, but the commissioner has been flexible to some extent, allowing people to replace without necessarily digging too deep into the restoration aspect. And in my position, I can see how difficult it is for property owners to always be able to pay for all these expensive restoration projects. So yeah, we have to keep that in mind. And as far as the staff level, we try to keep the owners aware of the difference between the local review versus the state, or in this case, Landmarks Illinois, if they have a project with the program.
Just to clarify for everyone, what you're referring to, Carlos, is when Landmarks Illinois holds preservation easements on
Correct.
designated properties in Evanston, that we will have our own separate review program.
Correct. I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, correct. I'm glad you brought that up. And, I think always probably the good advice to give owners who have easements is to come to us first for the review before your commission, knowing that our easement review may be slightly stricter than what the commission is looking at. And so the same goes with SHPO review for a property tax assessment freeze project. That's very true.
So the recommendation from our office would be that if they're going to do either program, which is voluntary through different agencies, if they come to the local review with that in hand that's been approved, it's most likely that they already made the standards of a local order.
And keep in mind too that Evanston is property owners, landmark property owners of commercial buildings have the ability to use Class L in Evanston. I don't know how many projects there have been now in Evanston to date that have used Class L. But it is another opportunity to also encourage landmarking of commercial properties, especially in your downtown or smaller commercial districts, that with Evanston landmark designation, a property owner can consider using Class L, that property tax incentive, as part of a rehabilitation. But it is your review. It is not a SHPO review. It is not a National Park Service review, because it's a Cook County property tax incentive. Cook County looks to the local commission to do that review. There are some basic standards in the legislation that everyone should be familiar with, but they're looking at your experienced commission to review a Class L project for a local landmark property.
Remind me what Class L is again?
So Class L is also a property tax incentive, but for commercial landmark properties. So you all are more familiar with the property tax assessment freeze program for single family homes, or condominium buildings can use it as well, which does go through State Historic Preservation Office review, because it is a statewide available program, even though the incentive ultimately comes from the county assessor's office. But the Cook County Class L incentive is a specific property tax incentive that was created years ago that Landmarks Illinois advocated for commercial properties just in Cook County. And basically it reclassifies commercial, industrial, landmark properties where the owner takes on a qualified, I think the spending threshold again is like a 25% of the market value, assessed market value. And reclassifies the property tax to a residential to a lower rate than it would be at the commercial industrial rate. And again, it's, I forget what the year period is. It may be again like a 10 to a 12-year period that it's reclassified. So it's a benefit in the end at the property tax level. Used in Chicago all the time. A lot of developers use it, overlay it with the federal historic tax credit for major projects. So again, I just encourage your commission to take a look at that incentive and remember that you can recommend it to commercial, locally landmarked property owners.
So it requires an ordinance from the city council to approve it. And it's a 8-year, if you want to call it freeze. Now, it isn't really a freeze. And then a 4-year step up period. It's a reclassification, as Lisa said, for commercial and retail property from 40% down to 10%.
So it's
essentially it's a reduction of 75% of your property taxes for 8 years with a proportionate step up for the last 4 to 12 years.
Yeah.
It doesn't work for residential property, which is already assessed at 10%.
Is this whether the commercial property is changed into residential, like condos and stuff, or is it no matter the use?
As Richard just pointed out, in that particular circumstance, if there was a conversion of a building to residential use, they're going to go down to that residential taxing rate anyway. So it really is for buildings that are still functioning in a commercial use. So industrial, retail, office. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, that makes sense.
Hotel.
But is Class L connected to a particular project? You must do, or it's just.
Yes, project by project.
It's project by project.
It's requested by the developer, like any other incentive may be sought by an owner.
When there's a particular project in mind, and then that project gets reviewed, triggers the review and all of that. Okay.
Yeah, I don't know, Carlos, how much track record there is with your commission projects for Class L.
We have one good example. That's the building that is on Davis and Orrington, the L-shaped building. The developer landmarked the building first, and then he went to the commission with alterations to the north and west elevation of the L shape. There was a building there that used to be a commercial building, that one story that was demolished. And he opened that as a plaza. And then he applied for the classification L because he restored the front elevations facing north and west of the L-shaped building. The only thing he did not do, he restored the steel windows, the stone facade and everything on the original facades. And then the two facades that were created by demolishing the building at the corner, he used concrete versus instead of stone cladding, and he used aluminum windows instead of steel windows. And the aluminum windows resemble the steel windows. So it was, sort of the difference between the original and the new, but the new was compatible, sympathetic to the original. And the commission at the end approved that, and then also they applied for the landmark designation. Then they applied for the tax credit.
They got it, Carlos.
Classification.
Yeah, so there's a good example of where your commission reviewed that project and approved it, and he was able to get the Class L incentive. Now, if that very same project had gone to the State Historic Preservation Office for review because he also wanted to use federal historic tax credits, I don't know if the building's on the National Register or not, that it may not have made the approval through the State Historic Preservation Office. It not, we don't know. But the point is you had a little more flexibility to work with this owner and still give that owner an opportunity for a local incentive.
Lisa, I don't know if you have the same experience, but in the recent past, when we had the opportunity to talk to someone who owns a commercial building in downtown Evanston, when we talk about the Class L, they tell us that it doesn't pay off for them for whatever reason. They don't explain, but they say it would be more expensive to do it than the benefit we get back.
I think it's worth. I just think it's worth pointing out that the new facades on the building that were created when the plaza was made by demoing the corner of the building are a beautiful example of a compatible facade that reflects the existing without slavishly duplicating it.
Right. Those facades were all brick and there were no windows. Now there's all windows with the concrete panels.
Yeah, and Carlos, I don't know, I think it's a case by case basis, and who knows when an owner makes a assumption like that, what it's based on, if it's based on true number crunching or just guessing. But I would say that if any commissioners or staff want to understand the Class L incentive better, that Deanna Cuvallo, who runs the Historic Preservation Division for the City of Chicago's Department of Planning and Development, and the Commission on Chicago Landmarks, is an excellent resource. I mean, she could talk to you about the variety of projects that the City of Chicago's commission has approved for Class L for commercial buildings, big and small.
The other obstacle for us is that we don't have too many buildings that are landmarked in the downtown.
Correct. From my perspective, it's a great way to try to persuade an owner.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think Kay has been interested in doing something like that. Since I remember talking about preservation, he's very curious about gathering information on buildings that would be eligible. And I think that would be a good thing because again, talking about my experience with the city is that when a nomination comes forward, when something is going to be demolished or something, one of the things that the opponents will say is, well, why now? This building has been there for decades and nobody pay attention to it, And if we have like a survey or something that will say this is eligible for designation or something, that will cover that question of why now and not, 5-10 years ago.
So there's so many projects that incorporate residential though, and that we see. So, and there's no partial if it's like whatever, 30% retail and 70% residential, that, there's residential in it, so it doesn't get Class L, correct?
Well, that's a good
It
point.
has to be income producing.
Well, yeah, but it might be, and I'm not certain about this, if it was condominiumized, so they were different ownership parcels. Maybe you can make a case that the commercial part would be eligible for Class L.
Correct. I was just going to say that. Yeah. So in that case, there could be a split.
Okay.
And again, apartments. Yeah, apartments would, it just doesn't work because again, apartments are classified at the lower. If Richard, am I correct? I think apartment buildings too are classified.
Yeah, all residences are classified as at 10% of market value. Take a look at your tax bill.
So that means that they don't need to apply for the Class L. They automatically will.
They're not eligible.
I think one thing to point out that Lisa brought up, the only time we see a lot of conflicts between a residence that's in the property tax freeze program and the requirements they have from the state versus our local requirements are when they have insurance payouts. That's really, it comes up pretty frequently where the insurance will only pay out for whatever the local governing body regulates and will allow. But then the property owner's kind of caught in this in between where they have a separate requirement from the state, for example, for maybe replacing in wood, where our ordinance might be able to replace in kind with vinyl or aluminum. So they'll pay out for the vinyl, but then the state won't sign off on it. That's really the only time I've seen that conflict.
Okay, that's an interesting scenario. Okay, I hadn't heard that before. So you're talking about when there's specific like storm damage to a property or something like that.
Correct, yeah. Mhm.
Well, that's a worthwhile conversation to have with Anthony Rubano and Carol Dyson and staff.
Well, our experience is recent experience. We have the hailstorm last year that damaged thousands of roofs, and so people who had the ceramic tile, they want to replace with the same, but the insurance would not pay for it. So it's that's a difficult situation, and yeah, and the commission, will have to review it and try to find a solution if they can. Okay, any other questions for Nick? Any comments from our attendees to the meeting? Okay. Kate, do you want to say any additional comments since you are our host for Nick?
I would just say one point Nick made that I think is really important is that the guidelines are not exclusively for the use of the commission and the commissioners. I think there's a lot of knowledge and understanding of our standards that is really institutionalized with whether it's Carlos and myself or the commissioners. And I think that the guidelines that we don't currently have, they really help to just disseminate that information and make it widely available. And I think the result is that people know what the expectations are when they come in for permit, which is helpful. I think that you'll get better applications because of that. And in theory, it should make the review process faster for you as commissioners. And then I think that what this does is it then ties into some of what Richard was talking about in that discussion, is that it frees up potentially time that is spent primarily now by the commission on what I would call resource management to explore additional aspects of a preservation program, like looking at nominating cultural sites or education and outreach, things like that. So these two discussions are tied together, is what I'm trying to say.
Well, that is a good point or question is, how much in these guidelines and stuff, how much are the, like the planning and zoning commissions interviewed and consulted before these guidelines are, to be on kind of on board or see where there may be conflicts. Nick, I don't know if you heard that question, but like how much do you talk to or interview the planning and zoning commissions or staff in the cities when you're writing the preservation guidelines to see if there are any major conflicts with something else the city has in place?
It kind of varies from client community to client community. In Mesa, we had to talk to their planning commission because they oversee, and bigger cities, you have a little bit more complicated land use regulations. In Mesa and their downtown, they have a form-based code overlay in their downtown. So we had to kind of work with at least understand with the commission how does the design guidelines fit in with their form-based code in their downtown. So it depends, yeah.
I think it's a really good point that you bring up. I think that there's obviously examples in all of our historic districts where it's a built environment that was constructed and predates our zoning ordinance. And so there's a lot of things that you may recommend in the guidelines that may not necessarily align with the zoning code. And I don't know if that's something you can spell out in the design guidelines. I would say that if it necessitated like someone to go to the zoning board or something, I would imagine that the guidelines could be used as justification for some of these requests, because we have some flexibility in our building code. There's not a lot of flexibility in terms of historic properties in the zoning code. We don't have a separate adaptive use code or a separate historic zoning code.
Well, the zoning ordinance does refer repeatedly to the preservation ordinance in historic districts and affecting landmarks. So basically, say for these situations where it may not be zoning compliant, you go to the zoning, to preservation ordinance. And our review by the zoning ordinance is advisory on zoning cases. That in this case would be major zoning variations, for instance. But when we're talking about historic preservation, if we're talking about restoration or rehabilitation, we're not necessarily making the zoning aspect of it worse than or less compliant. And I think there's some provisions as far as height for accessory structures. Okay, you probably are familiar with that more than I am, where the height of the barn is higher than the allowable height for a typical garage, that type of thing. So it's not totally missing the point as far as preservation. In back the day when the zoning ordinance was amended, and that was before 1994, there were preservation commissioners and the zoning board of appeals and staff worked together to kind of have a reference to the preservation ordinance for zoning situations. But it's not a separate document per se, it's embedded in the zoning ordinance.
And I have a question, just, you know, I think one of the real important things about design guidelines is making sure that the residents and the building owners, especially the homeowners, know about them and can, you know, familiarize themselves when they need to, when they're considering a project. But, you know, we've seen it when the homeowners, you know, are there and they just bought their house and they're just now gonna redo all the windows on, you know, the whole entire house, and all of a sudden then they heard about a preservation review. And so I'm just curious, with your experience nationwide with all the different districts, how are they reaching out to the communities and disseminating the design guidelines? I know we have ours online and whatnot, but just even especially just that new homeowner, like how do we get the design guidelines, and, you know, with the new people that are, you know, buying these houses and then wanting to do the best that they can with them?
You know, my best example, because we've done a lot of work with the city of San Antonio. I know it's a big city, but I use them as a model because they developed a whole new set of design guidelines about 7 or 8 years ago. And, you know, since then they've, what they like to do, and I kind of like this approach, is they do a lot of educational workshops and particular aspects of property maintenance and rehabilitation, you know, and, you know, how do you restore a historic window, and, you know, and things like that. And they use it as an opportunity to kind of explain the design guidelines and, you know, why is this important? Why is it important to keep historic windows, and how do you do compatible additions and things like that. So they kind of use this educational, you know, an educational program to kind of explain the design guidelines.
And offer maintenance things that you like, seminars or something. Is that what you were saying?
Correct. Yeah. And the second thing is they have a really strong relationship with neighborhood associations. I don't know offhand, but I have to think a majority of their historic districts. They also have conservation districts down there, which is, you know, another design management tool. And they have very strong relationships with neighborhood associations. And so they're able to kind of disseminate information through neighborhood associations. So I think San Antonio probably does it better than most communities out there, and how to get that information out. So
Yeah, I was just gonna say Shannon Miller, who's the head of the San Antonio Historic Preservation Office. She was a speaker for us at Landmarks Illinois last year as part of our Snapshots lecture series. And if you go to our website under our events page and then scroll down to our snapshot section, we have a video that you can watch of her presentation, which was actually more to Richard's presentation earlier, was on their cultural landmarks program and how they address the issue of landmarking and protecting places of cultural significance. So you may find that of interest too.
Thanks.
I was just going to say.
I'm sorry, go ahead. I'll go ahead.
Yeah, so when I worked in preservation in San Francisco before we moved here, we asked the same question about how to educate people. And our approach was to talk to realtors.
Yeah.
So I developed a whole program of working with realtors to try to help people, because my job at the firm, it was an architecture firm that specialized in historic preservation. My job was to answer the phone. So I always talked to these property owners who had just bought these buildings, had gone to the city and had been informed there. So I was in the mode of constantly having to calm people down because they were calling in crisis mode, and I was very empathetic. And so after a while, I heard the same thing. Why didn't my realtor tell me this? So, so that's part of my background. And I personally felt after a while that it was starting to be successful. We moved here, so I can't tell you. Sorry, the end of the story. I just told you the good bits. But anyway, I can tell you my personal experience here. This house that I'm sitting in is a City of Evanston landmark, and we bought it last year. And we knew to approach Kate and Carlos when we were in the middle of buying it. So thank you to Kate and Carlos who met with us the week the pandemic started.
Wow.
I'm sorry.
During your purchase process, that's
yes. As soon as we put the offer down, we knew that we had a project that we thought we might want to do, and so we met with Kate and Carlos before we actually had the closing. So thank you to them for taking the time to talk to us. But we knew that.
Yeah.
Our realtor didn't tell us to do that. We knew that because of our backgrounds.
Yeah.
Well,
So Lisa's shaking her head. She knows who we are.
That's an excellent point. And again, I'm going to throw out San Antonio again, because they have their preservation office established a certification program for realtors.
Oh.
Right.
So, and it's, and I think they do like once or twice a year training. And if you're a realtor and you sit through it, you get certified by the city. I don't know what the certification says or stands for, but yeah, that's an excellent point. I think other communities have done that too. So.
Yep.
Let me ask Kate and Carlos whether Evanston records the neighborhood or the district or the landmark status when they're passed by the city council. I know Chicago does.
I think only landmarks, but if you're just a contributing structure in a district, I don't think it's recorded on the.
Well,
we record landmarks.
Is it?
Say again, Carlos?
We do the landmarks, but not all the buildings in the historic district.
Yeah, I think Chicago records districts as well as landmarks. So no one has any question when you're buying a property that's going to show up on the title report.
Well, it's
So
on the zoning map too.
Yeah, well, Chicago's got this excellent zoning map that tells you everything. But sure, anybody who does the least kind of due diligence is going to discover that.
I just want to mention that we have over the years given presentations to realtors on Monday mornings when they have the meetings before they go out for the week. I was fortunate to work with the managers of offices when I contacted them about this solution for the problem, because some of the clients didn't know, or they didn't know. We've done it over the years, not every single year, but over the years. And the result of that is that now the realtors call our office. They know that they have a client that is interested in buying a house in a historic district, but not every single realtor will do that. So the information is out there. It depends on the realtor to contact us. But I think we can make it more visible in some fashion. So we should think about that.
Nick, we always used to talk about these homeowner welcome packets. I never really asked, like, who administers that? And is there a city that does that really well, or is it done through realtors?
That's a good question. I don't know offhand,
Yeah.
of a city that does that. I'm sure there's some example out there. But again, I think if you have any neighborhood groups or local organizations you can partner with on doing that. That
Or
help.
local real estate offices. I
Yeah.
mean, obviously it's hard because, with today's real estate world, you could be having a broker who's from anywhere on the North Shore, selling a house in Evanston. But if you at least, as a commission, maybe decided to reach out to all the local Evanston-based real estate offices with, a yearly update on the boundaries of all the historic districts and what the incentives are and what the process is for permit review or something, at least you can't be accused of not, disseminating the information to the realtor community. And maybe it may be that one of those real estate offices will actually ask at some point in time if one of the commissioners or staff people can give a presentation at a lunch hour for their brokers in their office. I do know different communities that have done that.
I know the city of Evanston, and correct me if I'm wrong, you do have that landmark information in your GIS system, right? I'm pretty
Yeah.
sure you guys do.
Yeah, we do.
We do.
Yeah, so it's in your GIS system, but it may not be the first thing that some people will look at. So, I mean, a lot of communities now are digitizing their survey information and making that more accessible. So, I mean, there may be people who just want it, would go to a historic preservation website first. So having your survey information digitized is important. I know Lakota, we do survey work, and we use digital platforms for it. And we hear back from the communities that it's one of their most accessed pieces of information that they have off their website. And we hear that developers always like to look for the non-contributing properties on those lists. So there's another side to it, but.
It'd be amazing if, even if it was a checkbox on the MLS listing. I mean, even at that level.
Right, yeah.
Yeah.
And then with a link to.
I should say that it's not on Zillow yet, which is the place where so many people find their homes.
Yeah.
But I don't know what's involved in that, but anyway, that's from MLS that's a great idea.
Yeah.
New
All right.
New project for Landmarks, Illinois.
Thanks, Richard. Well, we did do a realtor training program in Wilmette a couple of years ago, and where Carlos, I think you attended, and whoever were some of the commissioners at the time, but that's now already going on 7-8 years ago. So yeah, I mean, we've talked about it before, and point well taken.
Yeah, definitely we can dig more deeper. Yeah. Okay. Thank you so much, everyone. Unless there's another question or comment, I think that's been very fruitful for all of us to hear from two qualified professionals with experience in their own fields to share their ideas and experiences. And I'm glad that we have two new commissioners that obviously, I believe now they had even more of the flavor of what expected from us as commissioners and staff. And we look forward to continue doing this type of programming. I think that as far as education, we probably need to think about what can we do for the rest of the community, this type of presentations. People can join us. Any last thoughts, Richard or Nick?
Good to be with you. Thanks for the invitation.
Likewise.
Okay. So we'll keep you updated. I guess one of the things I've been working in the last couple months now, it's the director of the department has asked me to start developing the design guidelines for the city, for the Preservation Commission. I'm trying to put a team together of Evanston residents. I have some challenges like diversity of the team and whether they be only Evanston residents or professionals. Eventually, we're gonna decide, how many people. And right now, it's all in the preliminary stages. We are thinking whether we're gonna tap into some funding through the state or not, or we're gonna do it on our own. And whether we're gonna have a comprehensive set of guidelines versus, for historic districts individually, and obviously that will be a long-term type of project versus maybe comprehensive will be faster because then you put together what is most common. The districts are primarily residential. We don't have a downtown historic district, so that kind of makes it a little bit easier for us to develop the guidelines. So once we launch the program, my thought is to come to the commission from time to time to show our progress and get your comments. But I need to sort it out with the higher authorities, how they want me to approach this. My intent is to maintain the commission informed and get your input, because then eventually you're going to be the ones enforcing or administering the guidelines. So I have my pulse in the commission, my experience working with the commission and the different people have been appointed. It kind of gives me, I think, an idea how I'd like to approach this. I'm just hopeful that we will be able to come up with a plan that will be endorsed by the commission, and we move forward on that. And obviously, Kate is here to help us with the monthly meetings, and he's doing all the hard work now. And I'm trying to help him too when I can. I think we have a very good relationship together. We complement each other very well. He's much interested and genuinely interested about historic preservation. I'm very glad that he's in our team, and look forward to continue working with him. And we will look forward to work with the commission as well. So thank you very much, Kate, for putting together this retreat for the commission. Thank you for attending. So we'll see you next time. Thank you, Nick and Richard.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay.
This
Have a
is
good
great.
rest of the week.
Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.